I would like to acknowledge Pastor Smith, Reverend Young, and our youth president, Sister Celia, and all those tuning in right now. My name is Naomi, and I will be giving an exhortation on the theme within the veil, referring to other scriptures as well as Hebrews 6. Now, let's define this veil that the Bible speaks of in Hebrews 6 verse 19. This veil is what stood between us and God. You might ask why it was there. It started with the fall of man. So let's start, or let me give you a bit of backstory. In Genesis 3, we hear of Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden. It was provision for them. At the time, God the Son, which we know as Jesus Christ, had not come yet, or in other words, God had not taken on human form as yet. This is God in his spirit form. You could say God's relationship with Adam and Eve was a very strong bond, with things like God is allowing Adam to name the animals, and the fact that God, Adam and Eve had fellowship together. So everything was going all good until the incident of Genesis chapter 3 is where things changed. Here is the first record of the devil, also referred to as Satan, comes in as the form of a serpent to tell them to eat of this tree, the tree of knowledge, good and evil. This shows that sometimes we listen to other voices, and in doing so and following that up with action, we disobey God. Now the garden was provision of them. At the time, they knew no sin. In fact, God made us in his own image. Genesis 1 verse 26 to 27. God specifically commanded them not to eat from this tree, but with the persuasion from Satan, they ate this tree. This is known as the fall of man. So, by eating a fruit from this tree, they were now exposed to the sins of the world. They now knew what sin was, and sin had now entered the world. As a result of them eating the fruit, they disobeyed God, and they had to be cast out of the garden. This is the first time an animal had to be killed, because at the time, they were naked, but that wasn't an issue because they were fearfully and wonderfully made. There was no need for a lot of the things we have today. But because sin entered the world, they now had to be clothed. So they were in what the Bible refers to as aprons, which is animal skins. So because they had eaten of this fruit and they now had to be clothed, there now was a separation between them and God. Their access was denied from the garden. At the edge of the garden, from the east side, was placed a cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the tree of life. This separation between us and God meant something had to change and something had to happen. Now we are presented with the holies of holies, the inner and most sacred parts of the sanctuary. In the day of the old Hebrew service, so on the day of atonement is what it's also referred to, the high priest could enter into the holies of holies to bring sacrifice and offering unto God. Now let us define the holies of holies. So from books such as Exodus and Leviticus, it is not named necessarily the holies of holies. It has names like the holy place within the veil, most holy place. It was later given, particularly in the New Testament, the name holies of holies, which is commonly used. Now, in the sanctuary, it was split into two. This split was the veil, sometimes referred to as a curtain. The main part of this sanctuary was where everyone would fellowship together. So you had the people or the saints, and then you had the leaders. Then you had this big curtain right in the middle from top to bottom, spread wide. In fact, it was so significant and it was so mysterious that its fabrication itself concealed a mystery. People always wondered what was on the other side because they couldn't go beyond the point where the veil was. Only the priest could go in. The priest had to go in once a year on this Day of Atonement and offer up offering unto God. He would sprinkle blood, which was the animals that were sacrificed, underneath this flaming sword. In fact, in case of sinful nature and the priest being stricken down by God, as in dying in the presence of God, then they would tie a rope and a bell around the priest's waist. So if the priest was moving, of course it would ring, but if once it stopped, they assumed that the priest died, and by using the rope, because it would have been very long, they would pull the priest out of the area. That way they knew he was dead, because they knew that they didn't have access and they couldn't go beyond the veil. There was a chance that God would strike them down as well. Now, the holies of holies is where God's presence appeared. It's like how in the Garden of Eden, God's presence was always there. And there was a separation because God and sin cannot dwell in the same place. For God is perfect. He is all powerful. He is all knowing. Sin's nature, with the lying, the killing and the stealing, is nothing of God. The sacrifice of the animals under the flaming sword would only bring us access for a short time. As we referred to earlier, there had to be a change. Something different had to happen. This is where Jesus is born to us. And later on in his journey or in his life, he laid down his life on the cross for you and me. His blood, and his grace gave us access back. The access that was cut off for us in Genesis 3 is now been restored back to us, and today we still have that access to go before God for ourselves. We don't always need somebody to intercede on our behalf. God, or you could say God the Son, which is Jesus, is the intercessor on our behalf. We go to him and he brings it to God. This is how the two work. They are two in one. Grace gave us access. As I said before, the sacrifice of animals was only for a short period of time. It was not sufficient enough to take away our sins, but Christ, his death and his resurrection was a necessity and a power of sacrifice that brought about this purpose of access.